Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing how to get the most out of your pec contractions. My right eye is like leaking. If that's in 4K, I reckon you might see me cry today. So for hypertrophy reasons in the gym, we know that we need to be able to maximize tension across a large range of motion for the target muscle group. When we discuss the pec, that means taking it through a good stretch position, which is what we would typically see in most of your typical pec specific training exercises like your bench press, your dumbbell press, dumbbell flies and all of that. However, we also need to take the pec through a strong contraction under tension as well in that shortened position. And again, this is what you'll typically see more so in your fly progressions. And depending on the implement that you're using, whether it's a cable machine or a dumbbell, you're probably going to be able to bias towards a contracted or shortened position or a lengthened position for where you're getting your stimulus tension from for a hypertrophy outcome. But let's take a look at the pec anatomy first, and then we can start to better select exercises for both the lengthened position and also the shortened position for hypertrophy outcomes. So the pec here is obviously on the front side of the chest. We have a few different heads. We have a clavicular head, which is attaching to the clavicle, which is the collarbone. We also have a sternal head, which is attaching to the sternum. We also have like some costal attachments depending on your own anatomy, which is going to be down near the rib cage. You may actually feel that you actually have some attachment points down on the rib cage itself, almost very, very low where most of your pec muscles are. And it's going to attach on the front side of the humerus here. And it's pretty straightforward. When we talk about contracting a muscle, we're literally just trying to close the space between the two bones. So if we think about just closing the space between the front of the arm across even just to the sternum, that's how we're going to maximize our pec contraction. Yeah, there might be some slight IRs and ERs that we can do from the humerus to actually get a full contraction. However, we're probably going to catch 95% of a concentric orientation simply by closing off that position with our arm. And you can literally just sit there and play around with that yourself to squeeze and actually get that full contraction. When we discuss the upper extremity though, it's really, really important that we understand what the scapula is doing. And I have a scapula here because the scapula ultimately delivers the humerus, which is the arm bone. Unfortunately, I only have a femur. I left my arm at home, but I have a femur here that we can get the representation of what is actually occurring with the upper extremity through motion. However, I digress. When we discuss upper extremity motion, we need to understand what the scapula is doing because the scapula delivers the humerus through majority of the range of motion. And we know this when we go into upward rotation, that the scapula is going to take about 1/3 of that range of motion through upward rotation. The same is going to occur through downward rotation. When the scapula and the arm returns back down by our side, the scapula is almost going to support that motion coming back down to the bottom. So when we discuss our pec contraction, we need to know what the scap is doing. And if we flip back to where we were at the whiteboard there, we know that in order to get that peak contraction, we need to bring the humerus as far around the body as we can. The further around the body we can get that arm, the more we can concentrically orient and contract that pec muscle. And part of that means that we actually need to get the scapula to follow that humerus. And this is where we start to see a bit of a breakdown in logic when we think about big arched bench presses and pec contraction. Because ultimately, if we're trying to keep our scapula back whilst the arm is coming across, we're almost limiting the amount of range of motion in that shortened position that we can actually take the pec through. And this is why exercise selection from a hypertrophy outcome perspective, maybe your bench presses with a barbell aren't going to be the best choice of time. Yes, it could make up a part of it because ultimately it's a very high intensity sort of movement because of the high loads, and we can actually push some pretty big, hard RPEs. However, for the most part, we probably want to combine it with some other exercises throughout the gym that are going to cause that shortened position to be under tension the most. And that is where we can actually get the scapula to roll around the rib cage more so that we can actually squeeze that pec down. And again, just sitting there watching this, you can actually think about trying to keep your scap back and get as much pec contraction as you can, or letting the scap roll around forward, roll it around the rib cage, and you can actually feel a far greater contraction. So now we're going to go through some practical examples, and we're going to take you through a cable fly because I think that is probably going to be the best shortened position under tension that we can get in the gym. All right, Didier, you're on. So we've got Didier here who's going to show us how the range of motion actually gets reduced in a typical powerlifting bench press with a wide grip, a nice big arch and a high chest position. So as we can see here, this is sort of going to be where Didier finishes his press, and we can see the angle of the humerus. And we know that just by before how we can bring the humerus across, we can actually get this humerus almost perpendicular to the floor by allowing the scapula to roll around the rib cage and getting that full contraction of the pec. But if Didier goes through range of motion, we can see that the humerus is only probably going through about 50 degrees of range there. It gets down to about parallel with the ground, and then it passes just halfway, which would be 45 degrees. Whereas if Didier even just goes through like a hook lying position, so he's got his feet up, we've flattened the back down. Now we're going to see a far greater range of motion. And this is one of the reasons, we can already tell, this is one of the main reasons why we like the hook lying position. It allows for a greater loaded range of motion through the shoulder, through the glenohumeral joint. But if we go all the way through with a little bit of a reach at the top, we can see that now we're getting pretty much 90 degrees of range of motion, even more because we're dropping below the parallel on that bottom position there in that stretch position. So we can already see that utilizing a bench press arch and also utilizing a wide grip is going to significantly reduce the range of motion that we see at the glenohumeral joint. We're not really under a true stretch position in a completely lengthened position for the pec, and we're not really under a completely shortened position either under contraction. So really we're stuck in this midpoint that's not really going to bias either end of the spectrum for our hypertrophy outcome. But now let's go down to the cable machine and we'll see how we can actually get a full, both lengthened and shortened position for the pec. We're on. Crazy. If we remember the whiteboard and where the pec is going to be at its greatest contraction, we know that the scapula has to come around and we need to close off the space between the front of the shoulder here and pretty much the sternum is where we're going to get most of the fibers. So if we think about it, we're in this shortened position here. We call this adduction, internal rotation, depending on flexion and extension, depending on the fibers that we want to contract. But we can see where Didier is under the biggest pec contraction. If he contracts his pec hard here, that's sort of the finished position that we want to get to under load. So if we think about the biggest stretch position, it's probably going to be somewhere opposing that, which is going to be external rotation up in this direction. And we know that we can actually see a good stretch in his pec muscle here. So this is sort of where we're going to finish our fly here. So Didier now goes through the handles. With that understanding, we can actually start to move. We can get a big stretch on the pec and then a full contraction. And the biggest thing, as we were discussing, as I slip in behind Didier here, the biggest thing that we were discussing earlier with the scapula is we need the scapula to be moving around his body as he goes through that contraction. All the way around, he's going to round his upper back to a small degree and actually get that full squeeze of the pec fibers. So not only are we getting a good stretch position here with the cables, but we're also getting a really, really good contraction. And we can see how the range of motion from the humerus absolutely dwarfs what we were seeing over there with the bench press. And that's where we're starting to see how some of those bench press barbell movements for hypertrophy outcomes, by nature of going really, really heavy and trying to maximize load, we're actually going to be shortening the range of motion by default because it makes it a lot more difficult to lift heavy loads through a large range of motion. So it makes sense how some of these lighter, typically more traditional bodybuilding movements are going to bias larger ranges of motion with far less weight. We really only had 15 there. Didier could probably take it to 25 or 30. Before it actually gets too hard to actually execute the movement. And that is because we've biased more range of motion, We've really taken the target muscle through far more tension, both concentric and eccentric, and by that we've actually allowed a far greater hypertrophy response if we include progressive overload throughout a training program. So what are the actual take-homes from today's episode? If hypertrophy for the pecs are the goal, we need to take the pec through its largest lengthened position as well as its shortened, most heavily contracted position. And part of this is when we understand the anatomy, and you can do this with any muscle group, you just look at the anatomy, look at the textbook anatomy, the dead man's anatomy, and actually think about how we can shorten or lengthen that muscle in both directions. And when we understand that, we can actually pick our exercises and our exercise selection can become a little bit more accurate for the target outcome. So for the pec here, we need to take the arm across the body as far as we can and draw the whole system over towards the midline. Part of that is we need the scapula to support that movement, and we actually need the scapula to roll around the rib cage. This means that the bench presses, maybe even the dumbbell presses, might not be where we need to put all of our time and effort from a hypertrophy standpoint, but selecting some other exercises where we get a completely contracted position under load, like our cable fly, would be a really good sound exercise selection for pec hypertrophy. If you enjoyed this, there's the first cut. If you have any questions for this sort of stuff or want to see us break down any other muscle groups specifically, drop it down in the comment section below. Otherwise, like the video. The actual subs are rolling in at the moment, which is fantastic. So thank you to all the new subscribers to the channel. I'd highly recommend checking out some of the previous episodes that we've done on this channel because there's plenty of good content for you to take home. But otherwise, thanks for coming in this morning and happy lifting.